So this last part of section 3 in chapter 6 focuses on conserving biodiversity. And some of you in your activities kind of talked about how there are humans that are focusing on trying to minimize the effects that we're having on biodiversity and try and increase biodiversity. And that deals with conservation. Conservation is the wise management of natural resources, including the preservation of habitats and wildlife. So in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, the DNR, and this is an important agency that focuses on controlling different populations of all species within the state. They do a couple of different things. They work with hunting seasons and the regulations behind hunting. They are the ones kind of behind the whole wolf hunting season, looking at the wolf population and whether or not it should be hunted and how many can be hunted, that type of thing. They also focus on habitat reconstruction and the management of kind of the lands that have been set aside for wildlife. And this is something that can cause some issues within the community, looking at what's going on in the area right now with individuals' lands being looked at as setting aside for a state park, that type of thing. So there's lots of different things that kind of go into conservation when we look at the political standpoint, economical, people's lands, or if they live off their land and their land is being taken away for conservation, their livelihood can decrease. If we look at limiting hunting, those that hunt primarily for food, that can become an issue. So there's lots of things that are kind of hindering some of the conservation efforts. And think about how hard it is as maybe you as a student to think long term, like what you want to be, where you want to go to college, that type of thing. A lot of these conservation efforts are kind of long term. So looking at, okay, what would your children need and how are we going to create environments that are going to sustain as we continue to grow and expand as a population. So this kind of focus is the end of section 6.3, but it leads into section 6.4. So charting a course for the future, 6.4 in the book, and this really looks at kind of what's going to be happening long term. Remember, right now our human growth curve is what we call exponential, and because of that and some of the effects that we're having in biodiversity, while we think about the genetics of life, we also have to look at the impact on our planet. So researchers are gathering data to monitor and evaluate the effects of human activities on important systems in the biosphere. So think back to some of those cycles that we talked about, the nutrient cycles, water cycle, carbon cycle, all that type of thing, and how are we playing a role in that? So two of these systems that we're going to specifically look at is the ozone layer and the global climate systems. All right, so the first one, ozone depletion. So you guys this should all be pretty familiar. The ozone layer, it's a high concentration of ozone gas, which is actually O3, and is between 20 and 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The ozone layer is important because it reduces the amount of ultraviolet radiation, UV, that reaches the Earth. UV radiation causes sunburn, cancer, damage to eyes, and reduces organisms' resistance to disease. So it plays an important role. Problem that we're having is there's a hole in the ozone layer. One of the holes is located over Antarctica, and it's caused by these CFCs, remember the chlorofluorocarbons, and these are things that are going to react with O3 and cause there to be kind of loss of this ozone. CFCs were banned in 1987, and while the hole has reduced in size, hopefully expected to disappear within the next 50 years. But again, causing problems because of all those negatives we saw on the previous slide. Okay, so we have the ozone layer. That was kind of an issue, so we have to be concerned about kind of the pollution that we're putting in. We also have to, another kind of side effect of some of the pollution that we're having affects global climate change. Global warming, this is the big one. We already talked about the greenhouse effect in the sense of how it helps our biosphere maintain heat. Problem is, it's can be an increase in the average global temperature, so our overall biosphere is warming up more than we'd like. And since 1980, there has been an increase of 0.3 degrees Celsius, which doesn't seem like much, but when you think about kind of the ripple effect of the warming, the biggest one is the polar ice caps. So we're having ice to melt at the poles, and we think about kind of the chain reaction of how this is going to affect the different biomes. So the rate of ice melting, this is kind of a graphic, so you can see in the white where we can kind of outline it here, where the ice caps currently are and where they were. So just showing that that's a lot of kind of water entering back into the system, causing some sea levels to rise, that type of thing. Remember back to when we did that wind and ocean current lab and we talked about the densities of water and how that kind of changed things. And think about water, different temperatures of water being placed in there and what that means for currents and that type of thing. So it's not just necessarily the ice melting itself, but the other things that go along with that. All right, so Al Gore is the big guy here that really has been focusing on kind of global warming. And he cites just this evidence of global warming that the average global temperatures are increasing. However, one thing that we have to think about when we can get into this cycle of global warming and whatnot is that the Earth's climate changes all the time. There is this kind of normal climate cycle, and we think about the cycle that goes with the solar activity, that type of thing. So the Earth does have some typical cooling and warming kind of time periods. The thing here is the rate of CO2 in the atmosphere is always changing, and because of that, the temperature fluctuates. So because of the CO2 in the air, we think of these greenhouse gases that help the Earth retain its heat. The more we put into the air, the more retention of heat that we're going to have. Humans are impacting the climate and the CO2 levels because we are helping to increase those. Right, just some impacts that some of you already stated. Number of different ways. We're burning fossil fuels, so this is petroleum, oil, gasoline, that type of thing that has been trapped beneath the surface of the Earth, and we are kind of now exposing and releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. So stuff that has been kind of tucked and hidden away is now out into the atmosphere. We also have deforestation, the cutting down of wood. So these are the natural kind of CO2 scrubbers for us. They go and do their conversion, releasing oxygen. So by not having as many trees, we are not having as much CO2 being taken out of the atmosphere and being replaced with oxygen. Also, mining and just other things like that anything that's going to cause CO2 that was normally, or carbon products that were normally not accessible and not out in the atmosphere, anything that we're doing with that is going to influence the impact or the amount of carbon products in the air. Again, some of the effects of global warming, if this continues to be an issue, climate shift, altering the different biomes because of the temperature. We think of some of those animals that have adapted to a lot colder temperatures. How are those going to survive in a much warmer environment? And again, those that don't have the ability to adapt, we think back to kind of Darwin and evolution and that type of thing. If they don't have an adaptability, they're not going to survive. The polar areas increase ocean levels, which are going to cause flooding in some area, and it's going to totally change some of those coastal areas. We think of the marshes and the wetlands and things like that. Also, long drought through the summers is kind of possible when we look at variations and kind of the water cycle and how we're influencing that. So, in other words, there's lots of kind of possible side effects of a continual global warming, and it'll basically change the face of the planet and the level of biodiversity that we have. And just to show one of the effects when we talked about increasing sea levels, this shows you kind of Florida, how it is now, and on the next slide we're going to see what it looks like after sea level has risen. Alright, so we look at kind of the changes, and you can almost kind of see a little bit here, if I move this, kind of where Florida used to be. So some of these areas here, and I know that we've all seen maps before of some of the areas in the United States that are going to be impacted by this. So there's lots of kind of effects that are kind of pollution into the air, the releasing of the CFCs and the carbon containing components like CO2 are wreaking havoc, not necessarily on the biodiversity, but are going to influence the biodiversity because we are changing kind of the climate and weather patterns for all the different biomes. So this ends chapter 6.